Hey up everybody, welcome back to Yorkshire Fab Shop. Today in this one, we've got a really simple question to ask. And depending on how far you want to dive into the answer, will depend on how complex it is. So, what is it? Yes, very simple question, I know. But let me explain. Depending on what you're talking about, will depend on whether you'll need a simple answer or not. So if we take this as an example, what is it? A lot might say, it's a piece of steel. Others might say it's a rectangle, a couple of mil thick, it's brown, and there's others that might say, well, it's an iron-based alloy with elements such as carbon as alloying agents to make a strong steel, low-carbon steel. And then others might say, I simply don't know. But how do we ascertain what that is? How do we go about in our workshop finding out what that is? Now that's what we're going to cover today. We've got some basic tests to try and determine exactly, within reason, what that is. Now there are a couple of simple tests to do, and we'll go through them just in a minute. We can't get exact because we haven't got that sort of equipment, and more likely than not you haven't either. But we can get very close. We can tell the difference between a low carbon steel, medium, or a high carbon steel, whether it's even steel at all. So stick with us, get a brew, and we'll walk through some of the more common things you might find, and then there's maybe a couple that you haven't got but might come across in the future, who knows. Okay, so what I've done is I've run around the garage, found a nice selection of materials. A lot of these you probably have yourself. We've got a really simple test to try and determine essentially what they are, and it's a basic magnetism test. So I've got a magnet here. Quickly, I'm going to go through all these, and we're going to segregate magnetic from non-magnetic, because that's really important. We'll go through that shortly, but a lot of the non-magnetic stuff, we don't want to be moving on to the second test because it could cause us bother. Alright, so if we look at these non-ferrous materials then, let's try and differentiate between what we've got. Yes, I know there's a lot of people that are out there screaming, oh, I know what all they are, you don't need to bother, but there's probably a few people that don't know, which is why they're watching this. Start with this one. I've got quite a white metal, very light for its size. The ends are machined, quite lustrous. We've got like a dull outer surface, a dull oxide layer on there. The only thing that's really like that is aluminium. Another test we can do is we can try and cut it with a file or a saw, and we'll see that as we run over it's very soft and it gums the teeth of the file or the saw, whatever you're using to cut it. Now that's a surefire way of telling that that's aluminium, just because of how awkward it is to machine. Try it on a lathe and it'll stick to the tool, no problem. On a milling machine, if you want to run an end mill or something, it'll quite happily block it up. Pain to machine, pain to do anything with, but enough about that. So this one and this one, we're going to look at both of these because they're both related. So this is a nice shiny gold colour. Now I wish it was gold, but unfortunately it's not. It's in fact brass, and we can tell that by its really bright shiny finish, even on the sort of unmachined areas. So that as it left the processing plant where it's manufactured, the sort of oxide layer, if you like, 'cause it doesn't really oxidize, is dull, but it's still quite light gold coloured. Another thing with this is, like aluminium, is quite soft, so if you were to machine this, rub it with a file, remove some material quite easy, although there are certain properties to this which you should be aware of when machining. Now I'm pretty confident that that's brass, given its colour, given its weight, because it's quite a bit of weight there. Now this one's slightly different, still related to brass. It's got a lot of the similarities between brass. Nice, bright, not so much gold, it's slightly duller. Slightly orangey maybe, if you like, especially inside there, whereas machined that recently. Now because it's so closely related to brass, it's under good assumption that that's probably phosphor bronze. There's a couple of subtle differences between brass and phosphor bronze. Phosphor bronze inherently good for bushing materials, but it's like brass, it's difficult to machine. It's actually slightly harder than brass to machine in machining terminology, although it's not necessarily a harder material, it's slightly more difficult to machine. So I'm pretty confident with what they are. Move on to this one. We've got an orange, sort of brown orange material. It's quite discoloured, it's quite oxided up. Been sat about a bit, so it's discoloured because of it's been sat out unprotected. And if you rub that with a file to come up bright orange, there's just only one material that can be that, and it's of course copper. Copper being quite heavy, probably the heaviest material I've got in this little lineup. Now, as with the other two, it's very soft to machine. If you run a file over it, it'll peel off quite easily. There's not what else that can be. This one, slightly more interesting. Small piece of rod. Now it's very light. That's the first giveaway, it's very light. If you compare it to aluminium, not quite the same colour. Also the finish is slightly different. And if I run a file over this, it's come away quite well, more like steel than aluminium. It won't bung up the files or the saws or anything. The only material that is sort of similarly light to aluminium, but as hard as steel, or as strong as steel in many respects, is titanium. Now we'll be able to see exactly what that is in the next test. And we'll talk about some of these non-ferrous materials as well prior to that. But you might have noticed that I also segregated another pile. So we have highly magnetic stuff, and then you can just see in the top there, I'll drag these in. We had a couple of items that were classified as magnetic, because they are definitely magnetic. More so this fastener than this, because this, yes, the magnet does stick to it, but it's not very magnetic at all. A dead giveaway for certain materials and its non-magnetic properties is stainless steel, of course. Now we've got some writing on here, A2-70. If we look that up, we know that that is a specific grade of stainless steel for fasteners, and it gives us a specific strength of that fastener as well. So it's in a specific class. Now, you might be a bit confused to see why it's magnetic, but obviously it's got some iron in there as well. It's not just a stainless steel. It does have a small percentage of iron, and same with this. This is likely to be 316 stainless. This probably isn't. This might be a 304 maybe. If I looked that up, we'll be able to tell what type of stainless that is. So a nice giveaway on the bolt head there. And finally, we had this sort of small group of materials. Not a lot to say about many of these. Obviously, that's going to be a low carbon steel because it's plate, and that tends to be what it is. And we'll be able to prove that in the next test as well. But some of these others, file, well, that can remove steel, so that must be a slightly different grade of steel, but again, it's very, very magnetic. And as with the next test, we'll be able to prove that. But we've got a couple of oddballs in here. So this one, for starters. Now, thankfully, I know that this is a carbide end mill. Tungsten carbide. And you might be surprised to hear that tungsten carbide is actually magnetic. Good way of proving that is I haven't got anything in this workshop other than a grinder that will actually cut that. If you run it on a file, you'll dull the file. Same with this, we've got a little tungsten carbide insert, which is also magnetic. Not very magnetic, but slightly. But if we try and machine that, or cut it with anything, then it'll just laugh at us. We can put them to one side. We've got a bit of steel stock, not sure what grade that is, which is why we need to move on to another test to prove that. Same with this, so now it's a punch, so it's going to be a high carbon steel, but is it? We don't know. And then finally a drill. You'd expect that to be a specific grade, special grade of steel. Now, a lot of us already know that that's high speed steel. But how do we prove that? Because like everything else, it's magnetic. So we'll move on to the next test, and we'll try and sort of close in on what grade, what blend of steels we've got here. So for his next test then, yes, we've determined that we've got some items that are more magnetic than others, and some aren't magnetic at all. But how do we determine, say, carbon content? Because I haven't got a material analyzer here. Well, you can do what's called a spark test. Best way to do it is with a bench grinder, and it's what we're going to do in this video today. A quick note about these and grinding materials. I would strongly recommend that you don't grind any, I say any, most non-ferrous materials on here, because stainless steels are alright, titanium's alright, but things like brass, copper, aluminium, just keep them away for your own good, because what can happen, you might see a little bit of it on here already. I haven't been grinding aluminium, this is actually titanium that's embedded on here. It sticks to the wheel, and as the wheel heats up through use, it can cause the wheel to rupture, because the bits of material that have become impregnated on this wheel want to expand, force the wheel apart, and then you've got chunks of wheel flying at you when you're using it. You don't want that. So please don't grind brass, copper, aluminium, most of the non-ferrous stuff on your grinding wheels, because it'll not do you any good. So for this test then, I'm going to have this spinning away. I'm going to knock the lights off because you'll be able to see a lot more. Something I've noticed, not many do that. I don't know why, because it really does make a massive difference to what you can see. If you're looking in a brightly lit workshop, you'll miss a lot of the sort of the little features of a spark. Whereas with this, we can see everything in the dark. I'm going to start with mild steel, and we're going to work our way along, see if we can work out what sort of things we've got, and I'll talk through characteristics of the spark to look for. Should be quite interesting. Definitely worth a watch if you're trying to determine what you've got. Let's talk about some of the things that we're seeing now then. So this first one is a low carbon steel. It's a steel with less than 0.25% of carbon in it. This cannot be heat treated without adding extra carbon to it. So you can heat it up, quench it as much as you like, it's not going to get any harder. You can see from the spark profile we've got nice bright yellow, not so much white, more yellow-white spark forming immediately out of the material. We've got quite a long spark. We've not got a lot going on really, so we've got long lengths of spark, quite varied in length, but relatively long, and then we've got a little burst at the end of the sparks. Not too much activity, fairly uniform, so there's not a massive variance in spark length, spark size, and the spark size is a little burst. They're all very similar. This next one, we've got some medium carbon steel. So medium carbon being anything from 0.25% to just over 0.5% of its total makeup. This one has quite a bit more going on. Surprisingly, just to say there's only a small amount of carbon extra over the low carbon steel. So this is the N8 specifically. We've got a more varied length of spark. So we've got some quite long ones, and obviously some shorter ones, as well as we've got a really bright, again, yellow-white spark, similar to low carbon steel. But if you look at the ends, we've got more bursting or a bit more activity. The sparks are slightly bigger, they seem to be slightly more active. We can compare it to the low carbon steel, you can straight away see the difference. This is definitely this is definitely a different material. However, the colour and the length and the shape are all very, very similar. This next one is a high carbon steel. It's an old file, this. So we're looking at just over 0.5% up to 0.8% of carbon in this. Readily heat treatable, ideal for obviously materials that need to process others, so punches, files, things like that. So the spark profile, if we compare it to mild steel, is like a completely different material. We've got quite a short spark length in comparison. We've got varied spark lengths as well, and as a whole we've got a really, I suppose, bushy is the best word to describe it. Bushy spark profile. It's fanning out. Look at the ends, we've got really wide bursts of secondary sparks and some further bursts on from that as well. So in comparison to mild steel, like a total different material. Really easy to tell the difference between low and high carbon. Medium carbon can be slightly slightly harder to determine, but high carbon to low carbon, there's no comparison. It's plain as day to determine which one's which. This one I don't have a lot about, but other people work with this day in, day out. And this one is cast iron. And we can tell this because we've got quite a dull orange spark, short spark length, quite a consistent length though, so everything seems to be sort of stopping at the same point. We look at the ends, so we've got not a lot happening until the end of the spark where it's fanning out quite aggressively, so we've got quite a bushy spark, similar to high carbon steel, but it's all happening at the same point. The spark length's a lot shorter, duller spark. So now that we've covered the sort of the general steels, if you like, we move on to some of the stainless steels. And this first one of the two is a 304. I've not got a big selection of stainless, so I'm sorry I can't show more. So 304 stainless, we've got a medium spark length, sort of a duller colour than mild steel. It's more of an orange yellow as opposed to a bright yellow white. Straight sparks, not really fanning out a lot. It's not doing a great deal, to be honest. Fairly consistent length. There's no secondary sparks of any kind at all. But pretty easy to determine this one as a stainless steel in comparison to your carbon steels. The next one is a 316 stainless. There's not a lot, unfortunately, to determine whether it's a 316 or a 304. There are a couple of small secondary sparks in this one, but the lengths are similar, the colour's very similar. If you read manuals and read sort of information books, they'll tell you that there is a definite difference between the two, but unfortunately I can't really see the difference, and if I compare them, you probably won't be able to tell on the video either whether it's a 304 or a 316. But in comparison to mild steel, it's very different and very easy to determine that it isn't just a mild steel. But a magnetism test will tell you that it isn't a mild steel anyway, so it should be pretty easy to determine those ones. So with most of the steels and the materials that you'll tend to find normally kicking about, we're going to move on to some more exotic stuff now. This next one is high-speed steel. And straight away, in comparison to mild steel, we've got a really dull orange spark. It's not doing a right lot. It fans out a little bit. We've got a couple of small bursts at the ends of the sparks, but it's relatively short. It's quite straight, quite compact. It tends to be quite consistent in length as well. Another way to determine that it's high-speed steel, obviously, if you try and rub a file over it, you won't be able to process it, and or anything other than carbide you'll struggle to cut it with. So that's a dead giveaway. It's really hard in comparison to everything else you've got. So I've moved the camera in closer a little bit because these next few are quite exotic, as I said, and you don't really appreciate what the spark profile is from being further back. So this is a tungsten electrode. I'm a TIG welder. I think he's zirconiated, and we can see it's got a really short orange dull spark. Now length really short, quite compact spark. It's not really doing a right lot. There's no secondary bursts. There's no sort of excitement to it. It's just throwing straight sparks out, and that's it. That's your lot. Next on from the exotics, we've got a tungsten carbide lathe tool. Now, as with the tungsten electrode prior to this, we've got similar characteristics, but because it's carbided, everything is reduced. So the spark length is tiny, the colour is very similar, there's not a lot coming off it, there's not a lot happening with the spark, it's straight, it's compact, it's all doing the same thing, really dull orange. Another way to differentiate this between a lot of the other things, especially high-speed steel, is the fact that the arc length is short and it is magnetic, but not as magnetic. And trying to process this with anything in the workshop is difficult. You need diamond wheel, aluminium oxide, will touch it obviously, but slow going, and rubber file over it obviously is just going to laugh at it. Now this one I thought I'd show because it's quite interesting, but I very highly doubt that anybody's got any of this in their home workshop. Now this is quite a specialist material. It's an Incan, and I think it's Incan 617 off the top of my head. Now the interesting thing with this is we've got similar spark colour to tungsten and high-speed steel for that matter, really dull orange. It's quite a few sparks, so it's quite active, but what we tend to find is the sparks want to hug the wheel rather than being thrown off it, so we see a lot of them going around the wheel more than coming away from the wheel. So we've got short sparks, not very active, dull orange, short again. So some are a bit different, some of these probably not seen before, probably we won't see elsewhere. But there's not a lot to differentiate these between each other than, so this will rub with a file. You'll be able to remove material with a file with this. And obviously you can process it with tungsten carbide and high-speed steel. But in terms of looks, I mean, it looks similar to a stainless steel. So this last one then, everybody's favourite, we all love it, because it's the most exciting spark of the lot. It's the only non-ferrous material that really produces a vivid spark colour, and of course it's titanium. I spoke about it earlier. Bit of an oddity in the world of metals, because it's very light, but non-ferrous and sparks. So if you think of your units of Formula 1 racing, they had titanium ground plates on the back of them. So when you're diving into a corner, sparks flying out, they were always bright white. So it's got a titanium floor plate on there. And same with fireworks. If you've got any bright white fireworks, chances are they're burning this metal. So there's not a lot else really to compare this to, because there isn't another metal that produces a spark quite like this one. So you'll know if you've got it, because you can't compare it to anything else. Simple as that. And there we have it. So I've tried to show a good selection of materials there. We've got some general steels, some more specialist steels, and then some exotics there just for good measure. Who knows what you've got at home, so tried to cover sort of a broad array of materials there. And with the added benefit that it was in the dark, and I was really surprised how much you could see, to be honest. I've learned quite a lot from this, because I hadn't really taken into consideration the difference between a low carbon steel and a medium carbon steel. Obviously a high carbon steel is totally different between the three in terms of material identification. So I understand that it's probably not a good idea to weld high carbon steel to a low carbon steel component, but I'd never really considered, well, can I test them at home and can I prove what I've got? So that's been really good for me, and I hope it's been the same for you. Now, I will reiterate a point about non-ferrous materials such as your coppers and your aluminiums. Don't grind them in a bench grinder, please, because the potential for it to end in tears is high, and we don't need anybody getting hurt. But overall, as I said, I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been really, really good for me. I hope it's been as informative for you as well. And I hope you've taken some of the way from that. So, from Yorkshire Fab Shop, thanks for watching. See you next time.